The fire started at exactly 2:17 a.m. in the electrical panel of a house on Maple Street. David Stone had been retired for 3 months, but old habits die hard. He still listened to the fire department scanner while drinking his morning coffee. When he heard the address, something clicked in his mind. He'd responded to a fire on that same street 2 years ago. Different house. Same starting point. Electrical panel. That's when he pulled out his old case files and started mapping every fire he'd worked in the past 3 years. 47 fires. 47 electrical panel failures. And when he connected the addresses on a map, they formed a perfect route through Portland. Like someone was following a plan. Someone was burning his city down systematically. And the pattern suggested it was someone who knew exactly how fire investigations worked. Someone who knew how to make arson look like accidents. Someone like a firefighter. Welcome to Those Who Left a Trace, the channel where we uncover incredible stories of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary secrets that powerful people tried to bury. Before we dive into David's story, I have a question for you. What city or country are you watching from right now? Drop in the comment below. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far across the world this community reaches. And here's something I'm really curious about. Have you ever noticed a pattern that nobody else seemed to see? Maybe at work, in your neighborhood, or in the news? Have you ever suspected someone you trusted was doing something terrible, but nobody believed you? Share your experience in the comments. Sometimes the most important discoveries come from people who pay attention when everyone else looks away. If you enjoy stories about unsolved mysteries, betrayal by trusted friends, and retired heroes who refuse to let criminals get away with crimes, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. We bring you stories like this every week. Stories about people who saw what others missed and refused to stay silent. All right, let's get back to David Stone's basement, where he was about to discover that his former partner, the man who'd saved his life twice, was the arsonist destroying Portland. David Stone had spent 35 years with the Portland Fire Department, the last 12 as Battalion Chief commanding Station 14 in the city's Northeast District. He'd responded to thousands of fires, supervised hundreds of firefighters, and earned a reputation as someone who could read a fire scene the way other people read books. Fire investigation had always been his specialty. While other chiefs focused on suppression tactics and crew management, David had taken advanced courses in fire origin and cause determination, arson detection, and forensic fire analysis. He could walk through a burned structure and reconstruct what happened, where the fire started, how it spread, whether it was accidental or deliberate. That expertise had made him invaluable to the department, and occasionally frustrating to arsonists who thought they could fool investigators with clever staging. David had helped solve 43 arson cases during his career, testimony that had put 17 people in prison for deliberately setting fires. Retirement had been mandatory at 60, department policy that David had argued against but ultimately accepted. After 3.5 decades of shift work, emergency calls, and the constant stress of life or death decisions, part of him had been ready to step away. But only part of him. The rest of David. The part that lived for the puzzle of fire investigation. The satisfaction of finding answers. The purpose that came from protecting his community. That part was struggling with retirement. His wife had died 4 years earlier from cancer. His 2 children lived in different states with families of their own. And suddenly David found himself with unlimited time and nothing particularly urgent to fill it. Which is why he still listened to the fire department scanner. Why he still read incident reports that former colleagues forwarded to him. Why he still thought of himself as a firefighter, even though he no longer wore the uniform. And why, on a cold November morning 3 months into retirement, he noticed something that everyone else had missed. The house fire on Maple Street was routine by Portland standards. Single-family residence. Elderly occupant escaped safely. Structure heavily damaged but not destroyed. The incident report listed the cause as electrical failure in main service panel, a common enough occurrence in older homes with outdated wiring. David had read dozens of similar reports over the years. Electrical fires were frequent, especially in Portland's aging housing stock, where original wiring from the 1950s and 60s was still in use. But something about the Maple Street address triggered a memory. He'd responded to a fire on that street before. 2 years ago, maybe 3. Also an electrical panel failure. David went down to his basement where he'd stored 35 years of personal case files. His wife had called it his fire museum, shelves lined with binders containing reports, photographs, diagrams, and notes from every significant fire he'd worked. It took him 40 minutes to find what he was looking for. March 2021, house fire on Maple Street, 3 blocks from the current incident. Cause, electrical panel failure. The home had belonged to a different family, but the fire pattern was nearly identical. 2 electrical fires on the same street within 3 years. Unusual but not necessarily suspicious. Electrical systems in older neighborhoods often shared similar age and deterioration patterns. David closed the binder and started to return it to the shelf. Then he paused, thinking about the timing. March 2021. That had been just before his former partner Marcus Webb had taken early retirement for health reasons. Marcus Webb. David's mind drifted to his old friend and colleague. They'd worked together for 15 years, responded to hundreds of fires side by side, developed a kind of trust that only came from facing danger together repeatedly. Webb had been a solid firefighter, not exceptional but reliable and experienced. He'd saved David's life twice, once pulling him from a collapsing structure, once dragging him clear when David's breathing apparatus failed in heavy smoke. Then, 2 years ago, Webb had suddenly retired at 58, claiming health issues that required him to leave active service. David had been Battalion Chief by then, and while he'd been sorry to lose an experienced firefighter, he'd respected Webb's decision to prioritize his health. But now, sitting in his basement surrounded by decades of fire investigation records, David remembered something that bothered him. Webb's retirement had been sudden. No gradual decline, no warning signs of health problems. Just an abrupt announcement that he was leaving the department. And shortly after Webb retired, Portland's fire incident rate had increased. David pulled out his laptop and accessed the fire department's public incident database. He ran a search for structure fires in the past 3 years, filtering by cause. 47 fires attributed to electrical panel failures. Portland averaged about 12 to 15 electrical fires per year historically. 47 in 3 years was more than double the normal rate. David started pulling case files systematically, reading through reports he'd worked on and ones handled by other investigators after his retirement. He created a spreadsheet documenting each fire, date, location, cause, investigating officer, outcome. Patterns emerged quickly once he started looking. All 47 fires had started in electrical service panels. All occurred in residential properties between 15 and 70 years old. All happened between midnight and 4 a.m. when occupants were likely asleep. All were investigated and closed as accidental. But the detail that made David's hand stop moving across the keyboard was the geographic distribution. He imported the addresses into mapping software and plotted them across Portland. The fires weren't random. They formed a route, a deliberate path through the city starting in the southeast district, moving northeast, then northwest, then southwest, creating a rough spiral pattern centered on downtown. David had investigated enough arson series to recognize deliberate patterns. Random fires scattered across the city, with no relationship to each other. Serial arsonists often operated in familiar areas close to their homes or workplaces, or they followed patterns that satisfied psychological compulsions. This pattern was methodical, professional. Someone was working their way through Portland systematically, burning buildings in a sequence that suggested planning and purpose rather than random impulse. Someone who knew how to make arson look like electrical failure. Someone who understood fire investigation well enough to fool experienced inspectors. Someone with knowledge of Portland's neighborhoods, building construction, and fire department response patterns. Someone like a firefighter. David felt cold spreading through his chest. He didn't want to follow this line of thinking. Didn't want to suspect that someone from his own profession might be responsible. But he'd spent 35 years following evidence wherever it led, and the evidence was pointing towards someone with insider knowledge. He started reviewing the investigation reports more carefully, looking for names of investigators, witnesses, anyone who appeared repeatedly in the documentation. On the 18th fire report, dated October 2022, he found a name in the witness statement section that made him stop breathing. Marcus Webb, fire damage assessment consultant. Webb had provided expert testimony to the insurance company about the extent of fire damage and whether the claim was legitimate. His statement supported the finding that the fire was accidental and the damage claim was valid. David checked the next report. Different fire, different date, different neighborhood. But there in the insurance section, Marcus Webb, fire damage assessment consultant. He checked 5 more reports. Webb's name appeared in 3 of them. David sat back from his computer, his mind racing. After retiring from the fire department, Marcus Webb had apparently started working as a private consultant, helping insurance companies assess fire damage claims. That wasn't unusual. Many retired firefighters with investigation experience moved into private sector work evaluating fire scenes for insurance purposes. But appearing on multiple investigation reports for fires that showed suspicious patterns? That was concerning. David spent the next 6 hours systematically checking every fire report from the past 3 years. Of the 47 electrical panel fires, Marcus Webb had been involved in the insurance assessment for 19 of them, nearly half. The financial motive was obvious. Fire damage consultants were paid substantial fees by insurance companies, typically $1,500 to $3,000 per assessment. If Webb had been paid for 19 assessments, he'd earned somewhere between $28,000 and $57,000. But that assumed Webb was simply being hired to assess fires that happened coincidentally. What if he was creating the fires specifically so he could be hired to assess them? David knew that insurance companies often use repeat consultants, hiring the same experts for multiple assessments if they provided reliable work. If Webb had established himself as a go-to consultant for electrical fire assessments, insurance companies would keep calling him for new cases. Creating fires would create business. And who better to create fires that looked accidental than someone who'd spent 25 years learning how fire investigations worked? David wanted to be wrong. Wanted there to be an innocent explanation. Marcus Webb was his former partner. Someone he'd trusted with his life. Someone he considered a friend. But the evidence was building a case that was hard to ignore. He started researching Webb's life after retirement. Social media provided some information. Facebook posts showing increasing financial stress, complaints about insufficient retirement income, mentions of medical bills and debt. LinkedIn showed Webb had started his consulting business 6 months after retiring, marketing himself as an expert in fire cause and origin determination. Public records showed Webb had divorced 18 months ago, sold his house, and moved to a small apartment in Northeast Portland. Credit reports, which David accessed through a former colleague who worked in insurance fraud investigation, showed significant debt, including 2 Max credit cards and a personal loan with a predatory interest rate. Marcus Webb needed money. Marcus Webb had expertise in starting fires that looked accidental. And Marcus Webb was profiting from fires that were occurring at double the normal rate in Portland. David knew he needed to report this to authorities. But he also knew that pattern analysis and suspicious coincidences weren't enough for criminal prosecution. He needed direct evidence linking Webb to specific fires. He decided to start with the geographic pattern. If the fires were following a deliberate route through Portland, and if Webb was responsible, there should be a logical next target. David plotted the 47 fires on a detailed city map, noting the dates and drawing lines connecting them in chronological order. The spiral pattern became more obvious when visualized this way, fires starting in outer districts and gradually moving inward. Based on the pattern, the next fire should occur in the overlooked neighborhood, probably within a 2-mile radius of the last incident. David spent 3 days driving through the overlook area, studying houses that fit the profile, older construction, visible electrical service panels on exterior walls, properties that appeared occupied but not heavily secured. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Couldn't surveil every potential target. Couldn't prove anything without witnessing actual criminal activity. But he could watch Marcus Webb. David parked outside Webb's apartment building for 3 consecutive nights, sitting in his truck with coffee and a camera with a telephoto lens. He felt like a stalker, uncomfortable with surveilling someone who'd once been his friend. On the 4th night, Webb emerged at 1:30 a.m. He was carrying a backpack and wearing dark clothing, walking quickly toward an older model sedan parked on the street. David followed at a distance, his firefighter instincts warring with his investigator training. Part of him wanted to confront Webb immediately, demand an explanation. The other part knew that confrontation without proof would simply alert a suspect and destroy any chance of gathering evidence. Webb drove to the overlooked neighborhood, parking 3 blocks from an older Victorian-style house with peeling paint and an electrical service panel mounted on the exterior wall near the basement. David parked farther back, watching through his camera as Webb sat in his car for 15 minutes, apparently scanning the area for witnesses or security cameras. Then Webb got out, pulled on gloves, and walked casually toward the house as if he belonged there. David's heart was pounding. He grabbed his phone, ready to call 911. But he hesitated. If he called now, what would he report? A man walking near a house? That wasn't a crime. He needed to witness actual criminal activity before involving police. Webb approached the electrical service panel, glancing around once more before opening his backpack. Even from a distance, David could see what Webb pulled out: wire cutters, a small device that looked like it might be an accelerant timer, and what appeared to be a modified electrical component. David had seen enough. He dialed 911 while simultaneously starting a video recording on his phone. 911, what's your emergency? This is David Stone, retired Battalion Chief with Portland Fire. I'm witnessing what appears to be attempted arson at 2847 Overlook Avenue. Suspect is tampering with the electrical service panel. I'm recording video and maintaining visual contact. The dispatcher asked him to stay on the line while she dispatched police and fire units. David kept his phone camera aimed at Webb, capturing clear footage of his former partner working at the electrical panel. Whatever Webb was installing, he worked quickly and efficiently. Within 3 minutes, he closed the panel, returned his tools to the backpack, and was walking back toward his car. David faced a choice: let Webb leave and wait for police to arrive, potentially losing the suspect, or confront him directly and risk violence or evidence destruction. Before he could decide, Webb glanced in David's direction. Their eyes met across the dark street. For a moment, neither man moved. Then recognition flashed across Webb's face, followed by shock and something that looked like resignation. Webb didn't run. He stood there in the middle of the street, backpack hanging from one shoulder, staring at his former battalion chief. David got out his truck, phone still recording, 911 dispatcher still on the line. He walked toward Webb slowly, deliberately, the way he'd approach any dangerous situation. Marcus, David said quietly, don't make this worse. Police are on their way. Webb's expression cycled through emotions: surprise, anger, fear, and finally a kind of exhausted defeat. How long have you known? About 2 weeks. Started noticing the pattern after retirement. Took me a while to work it all out. The pattern? Webb laughed bitterly. Of course you noticed the pattern. You always saw things nobody else saw. Why, Marcus? We were partners. I trusted you. Trust doesn't pay bills, David. Webb's voice carried decades of resentment. You got to be battalion chief, got a decent pension, got respect. I got forced out because the new chief decided I was too old, too slow, not progressive enough for the modern department. My pension barely covers rent. My ex-wife got most of our savings in the divorce. I needed money, and I knew I'd make fires that nobody would question. You killed people, Marcus. The fire on Burnside, 73-year-old woman died from smoke inhalation. That wasn't supposed to happen. I picked times when people should be awake, could get out safely. I picked houses with working smoke detectors. Those deaths weren't. Webb stopped, perhaps realizing that explaining why accidental deaths from his deliberate crimes weren't his fault wouldn't help his situation. David heard sirens approaching. What did you put in the electrical panel? Modified timer circuit connected to the main breaker. Creates an overload that causes sparking and ignition in the panel. Looks exactly like an old breaker failure. Burns up all the evidence of tampering. I learned it from a case we worked together back in 2015, remember? The warehouse fire where the owner tried to stage an electrical fire for insurance. David did remember. They'd figured out that case together, identifying a modified breaker that created a delayed electrical fire. Now Webb had used that same knowledge to become the arsonist he'd once helped catch. You have to disable it, Marcus. There's a family sleeping in that house. Webb looked at the Victorian house, then back at David. For a moment, David saw the firefighter he'd known for 15 years, the man who'd saved his life twice, someone who'd once cared about protecting people. Webb walked back to the electrical panel, opened it, and removed the device he'd installed. He handed it to David just as the first police car arrived, lights flashing, sirens wailing loud enough to wake the neighborhood. Officers approached with weapons drawn, ordering Webb to the ground. He complied without resistance, lying face down on the pavement while officers handcuffed him. One of the officers recognized David from his years working with the police on arson investigations. "Chief Stone, what's going on here?" "This man is Marcus Webb, former Portland firefighter. I have video evidence of him tampering with this house's electrical panel with intent to commit arson. I believe he's responsible for 47 similar fires in Portland over the past 3 years. The device I'm holding is what he was installing. It's a modified electrical timer designed to cause panel failure and ignition." More police cars arrived, along with Fire Department Battalion Chief and an arson investigator David had trained years ago. He handed over his phone with the video evidence, provided the detailed documentation he'd compiled, and explained the pattern analysis that had led him to suspect Webb. The house's residents, a young family with 2 children, came outside to see what was happening. David explained that they'd nearly been victims of arson, that their electrical panel had been tampered with, and that fire department electricians would need to inspect and repair it. The mother started crying, clutching her children, and thanking David repeatedly. The father just stared at the electrical panel that had nearly killed his family. While they slept, Webb was taken into custody and transported to the county jail. David spent the next 4 hours providing statements to police and fire investigators, walking them through his documentation, explaining the pattern he'd identified. As dawn broke over Portland, David finally headed home. He felt exhausted, sad, and angry. Angry at Webb for betraying everything firefighters stood for. Sad that someone he'd once trusted had become the enemy. Exhausted by the weight of recognizing that 3 years of fires, 3 deaths, dozens of families displaced, and millions of dollars in damages had been caused by someone who'd once been his partner. The investigation that followed was massive. Fire and police departments worked together reviewing every electrical panel fire in Portland over the past 3 years. Using David's pattern analysis and Webb's eventual confession, they identified 47 fires that Webb had deliberately set. Webb's technique had been sophisticated and nearly undetectable. He targeted houses with old electrical systems, identifying properties where electrical failure would be plausible. He used his knowledge of fire investigation to avoid detection methods, ensuring that his modified timers burned completely and left patterns identical to natural electrical failures. He'd been careful about timing, setting his devices to activate hours after installation when he'd be far from the scene with alibis. He'd avoided targeting properties where he thought serious injury was likely, though precautions had failed 3 times, resulting in deaths he claimed were accidental. The financial trail proved David's theory. Webb had earned over $60,000 from insurance companies for fire damage assessments on 19 of the fires he'd secretly started. He'd also filed insurance claims on 3 properties he'd damaged, collecting settlements while working as a consultant evaluating his own crimes. But money wasn't Webb's only motivation. During interrogation, he revealed deep resentment toward the fire department that had forced his early retirement, toward the new battalion chief who'd replaced David, toward a system that he felt had discarded him after 25 years of service. "I gave my whole life to that department," Webb said during one interview. "Saved lives, fought fires, never refused a call. Then they decide I'm too old and push me out with a pension that won't even cover rent. They made me nothing. So I made them look incompetent. Made them run around responding to fires they couldn't solve because I was smarter than their whole investigation system." The psychology reports called it a combination of financial desperation and revenge, a toxic mix that had turned a once dedicated firefighter into someone who deliberately endangered the community he'd sworn to protect. Marcus Webb was charged with 47 counts of arson, 3 counts of negligent homicide, and additional charges related to insurance fraud. He pleaded guilty as part of a deal that avoided trial and sentenced him to 32 years in federal prison. The 3 families whose loved ones had died in Webb's fires attended the sentencing. David was there too, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching his former partner being led away in chains. After the sentencing, one of the victim's family members approached David, the son of the elderly woman who died in the Burnside fire. "Mr. Stone, they told me you're the one who figured out these weren't accidents, that you caught the man who killed my mother." David nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "I'm sorry I didn't figure out sooner. I'm sorry I worked with him for 15 years and never saw what he was capable of becoming. You couldn't have known, but you noticed when nobody else did. You paid attention when everyone else was ready to accept the easy answers. That matters. Thank you." David attended a fire department ceremony 6 months after Webb's conviction. The department presented him with a civilian commendation for his investigation work and invited him to speak to current arson investigators about pattern recognition and the importance of questioning routine findings. The most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about causes we think we understand. David told a room full of investigators. Electrical fires are common, so we expect to see them. That expectation can blind us to patterns that suggest something else is happening. It took me 3 months of retirement and time to step back before I noticed what everyone, including me, had missed while working cases day to day. He paused, thinking about Marcus Webb. And the hardest cases to solve are the ones where the suspect is someone we trust, someone who knows our procedures, understands our methods, and can exploit our blind spots. We need to remain skeptical even of people we think we know. The Portland Fire Department implemented new protocols after the Webb case. Electrical fire investigations would now include mandatory secondary review by different investigators. Pattern analysis software would flag clusters of similar fires for additional scrutiny. And consultants hired for insurance assessments will be subject to conflict of interest screening. David returned to retirement, but with a new purpose. He started teaching fire investigation courses at the community college, training new firefighters and investigators in pattern recognition and critical analysis. He consulted on cold cases for fire department, applying his decades of experience to unsolved arsons. And he continued monitoring fire incidents in Portland, maintaining his habit of listening to scanner traffic and reading reports. Not because he suspected ongoing criminal activity, but because after 35 years, firefighting wasn't just what he'd done, it was who he was. 2 years after Webb's conviction, David received a letter forwarded to the prison system. Marcus Webb had written from federal prison. The letter was difficult to read, filled with rambling justifications and half-formed apologies. Webb claimed he'd never intended to hurt anyone, that the deaths haunted him, that financial desperation and anger had driven him to actions he regretted. He also wrote something that David found particularly disturbing. "You and I were the same, David. Both of us defined by the fire department. Both of us struggling with who we were outside a uniform. The difference is you found a way to live with retirement. I couldn't. I needed to matter, needed to be important, needed to feel like I was still part of the work. Setting fires and solving them, even secretly, made me feel like I was still a firefighter. I know that's crazy, but it's the truth." David didn't respond to the letter. There was nothing to say. Webb was right that they both struggled with retirement, with defining themselves outside their careers. But where David had found healthy ways to maintain connection to his profession, teaching, consulting, maintaining community relationships, Webb had created a destructive cycle that hurt the community he'd once served. 3 years after the case, David was invited to speak at a National Fire Investigation Conference in Chicago. His presentation on the Webb case became one of the most attended sessions, with investigators from across the country wanting to learn about pattern recognition in arson series. During the Q&A session, a young investigator from Seattle raised her hand. "Chief Stone, what made you look for patterns in the first place?" Most people would have just accepted that electrical fires are common and moved on. David thought about that question carefully before answering. "I think it was a combination of experience, time, and maybe a little bit of not being ready to completely retire. I'd spent 35 years training myself to see patterns, to question convenient explanations, to dig deeper when something felt wrong. Even after leaving the department officially, I couldn't turn off that part of my brain." He paused. "But I also think there's something important about perspective. When you're working cases day to day, your focus on immediate investigation in front of you. You don't always see the bigger picture because you're too close to individual trees to notice the forest. Retirement gave me distance. Time to look at multiple cases together, to spot connections that weren't obvious when dealing with each fire separately. Another investigator asked, "Do you think there are other cases like this? Other series that look like accidents but are actually deliberate?" "Probably," David admitted. "Statistical anomalies exist in every city. Clusters of similar fires that might be coincidence or might be something more. We don't know because we don't always look. We accept explanations that seem reasonable without questioning whether the overall pattern is reasonable." After the conference, David was approached by an FBI agent who specialized in serial arson investigations. "Chief Stone, would you be interested in consulting on some cold cases? We have several unsolved series across the country where pattern analysis might help identify connections we've missed." David agreed. Over the next 2 years, his pattern analysis helped solve for additional arson series in different cities. None involved firefighters as perpetrators, but all involved someone with specialized knowledge who'd been setting fires that appeared accidental while flying under investigator radar. At 65, David Stone had found a new career as a fire investigation consultant, teaching pattern recognition and helping departments across the country identify suspicious clusters of seemingly unrelated fires. He thought often about Marcus Webb, about how someone dedicated to saving lives had become someone who took them, about how financial pressure and resentment could corrupt someone's fundamental values, about how the same knowledge used to fight fires could be weaponized to start them. But he also thought about the families who'd received answers, the communities that had been made safer, and the investigators who'd learned to look beyond convenient explanations toward harder truths. David had become a firefighter because he wanted to save lives and protect his community. Even in retirement, even after discovering that one of his own had betrayed everything they'd stood for, he was still doing that work, just in a different way. The hardest part of the Webb case hadn't been the investigation or the evidence gathering. It had been accepting that someone he'd trusted, someone he'd worked beside for 15 years, someone who'd saved his life, could become his enemy. But David had learned something crucial through that painful experience. Trust couldn't be blind. Loyalty couldn't excuse examination. And the most important thing wasn't protecting reputations or maintaining comfortable relationships. It was protecting the community, no matter who the threat came from. 10 years after the case, David received news that Marcus Webb had died in prison from cancer. He was 73 years old, having served only 10 years of his 32-year sentence. David attended the small memorial service, one of only 3 people present. Webb's ex-wife came, crying despite their bitter divorce. A former firefighter who'd remained Webb's friend attended, talking about the man Webb had been before everything went wrong. David said nothing during the service. He had no words that would reconcile the Marcus Webb he'd known with the Marcus Webb who'd burned Portland for profit and revenge. After the service, Webb's ex-wife approached David. "Thank you for coming. I know Marcus betrayed you. I know you're probably the last person who wanted to be here. He was my partner for 15 years, David said quietly. Before everything else, before the crimes and the trial, we were partners. I came to honor that, even though what came after destroyed it. He told me once, near the end, that the worst part wasn't prison. It was knowing that you figured it out. That the one person whose respect he'd valued most was the one who brought him down." David nodded. "I think about that sometimes. Whether catching him was justice or betrayal. I decided it was both, and that justice had to win." David Stone continued working as a fire investigation consultant until he was 72, finally fully retiring when his health made travel difficult. By then, he'd helped solve 37 arson series across North America, train over 500 fire investigators in pattern recognition techniques, and become recognized as one of the leading experts in detecting sophisticated arson schemes. His legacy wasn't just the cases he solved, but the methodology he taught. Questioning convenient explanations, looking for patterns across multiple incidents, maintaining healthy skepticism even toward trusted individuals. The Marcus Webb case remained his most famous investigation, the one that fire investigation students learned about in training courses, the one that changed how departments approached electrical fire investigations. But for David, It remained his most painful case, the one that taught him that expertise and dedication didn't prevent people from corrupting themselves. That financial pressure and resentment could transform heroes into criminals. And that the hardest part of seeking truth was accepting what you found, even when it destroyed relationships you'd valued. In the end, David Stone was remembered for two legacies: 35 years of dedicated service protecting Portland from fires, and the pattern recognition that exposed 47 fires set by someone who'd once been his brother in service. Both legacies mattered. Both were necessary. And both came from the same fundamental commitment: to protect the community, follow the evidence, and never stop asking questions, no matter how painful the answers might be.